Hello, today we are beginning Module 4 on Aristotle's Politics. The module will consist of the following content. First, we're going to discuss some basic preliminaries, as well as sort of the purpose and origin of the polis, according to Aristotle. Then we will talk about how Aristotle offers a kind of a taxonomy of different forms of political rulers or different forms of political relationships. And then we'll discuss, according to Aristotle, these different forms of natural and unnatural slavery, which will be quite important for this module. In addition to that, we're going to talk about the term logos and how that relates to Aristotle's claim that human beings are political animals in addition to being rational animals. And then finally, we're going to try to think about this question of in what way is the polis prior to the individual? This is a claim that Aristotle makes, and so I want to pay attention to it. And once you've watched these video lectures, at that point, I'd like you to turn to some short videos dealing with Martin Luther King Jr.'s views regarding civil rights. So now that we have the basic content for this module on the table, let's just turn to some preliminary issues. First of all, Aristotle's Politics is composed of 8 books. And similar to what I mentioned last time regarding the Nicomachean Ethics, this book, the Politics, is basically lecture notes. In fact, we're not even really sure to what extent they follow the right order, but they do have the appearance of being lecture notes. So these would have been the sort of things that Aristotle was teaching his students, the lecture notes he used when he was teaching in the Lyceum. Of course, we're not going to be able to get through all 8 of the books in this course, so we're going to look at the books that Martin Luther King Jr. focused on, which was books 1 and 2. Specifically, we're going to think about what is the purpose and the nature of the polis. And remember, this term just means the city-state. We're going to look at the relationship between the individual, the family, and the polis. We will look at what exactly it means to say that the polis is prior to the individual. We'll look at some of the different forms of government that Aristotle mentions. And we will look at Aristotle's theory and justification of slavery. And we will consider in what way the term logos relates to terms that you might be more familiar with, terms like logic, reason, rationality, and how all of that fits into Aristotle's view of political activity. And then finally, we will consider Aristotle's ideal form of political rule. What would that look like? And interestingly, Martin Luther King Jr. asked his students when he taught this course, he asked him to answer the following essay question: state and evaluate Aristotle's theory of slavery. So that's why I mentioned that Aristotle's view of the notion of natural and unnatural slavery is going to be important for this module, because that's a question I want you to answer as well. That will be one of your essay questions that you might choose to answer at the end of this course. All right then, so enough with the preliminaries. Let's get right into things and consider the purpose and origin of the polis according to Aristotle. And just as I mentioned a moment ago, the term polis means city-state. So we can ask, what is the purpose of the polis? According to Aristotle, the highest good for a human being is philosophy, right? The highest goal, the highest aim, the highest purpose that we have as human beings is to philosophize, to be a philosopher, to think about philosophical issues all day long. Of course, that's not very realistic. Most people will never actually achieve this end. And insofar as we need to be thinking about the purpose or the end for all human beings, all rational animals, we need to understand that in terms of that not everybody's going to philosophize. Not everyone's going to be a philosopher. So then the next question is, what is a more realistic aim or end for us rational animals? According to Aristotle, the highest practical good or end for a human being is political engagement, political activity, political activism, if you will, to be engaged with the political community. And that's very much a practical form of philosophizing. It's a kind of applied philosophy, if you will. So then, a life that lacks political engagement and activity in the social community, such a life cannot have achieved human flourishing or eudaimonia, right? And insofar as eudaimonia is the very thing that our lives are aiming at, right? That's our function, that's our purpose. Then, according to Aristotle, that means that we must be politically engaged. We must engage with our social community in a rational way. And if that's right, then the purpose of the polis is not merely or exclusively to provide safety for its citizens. This was a kind of a common view, right? The purpose of government is to protect the citizens. It's a kind of a contract theory, if you will, right? The rulers will protect the citizens from the barbarians outside of the city. In fact, even today, we have a very strong political view known as libertarianism, where this sort of view puts all of the focus on a limited government, one that its sole job would be to protect its citizens. Its sole purpose, the government, would be to have a strong army, if you will. However, for Aristotle, the primary purpose of the polis, right, the main role for the government is to help the citizens achieve eudaimonia through political engagement. So the job of the government isn't merely to protect its citizens through a strong army, rather it's to help citizens be happy, to live a good life, to have human flourishing, to live well. All these things that, according to Aristotle, is the function of being a human being, the sort of purpose of being a rational animal. So we will see then that this means every citizen must participate in political activity. Therefore, the purpose of the polis is to promote the happiness of every one of the citizens, all human beings, all rational animals. So then that is the purpose of the polis. That's the purpose of government. Our next question then is, what is the origin of the polis? What's the origin of government? Additionally, we'll need to ask, in what way is the polis prior to the individual? In what way, according to Aristotle, is it that the government is prior to you, to me, and all the other citizens? In what way is it that that the city state, the institutions that comprise and make up our government, supposed to somehow be prior to you? In what way are you dependent upon the government? In what way am I dependent upon the government? That's a central question that we'll need to consider as well. But first, I want to consider the question of what is the origin of the polis, at least according to Aristotle. We have to keep in mind that this should be interpreted as a just so story, right? Aristotle wasn't able to go back in time. Of course, we can't either, so there wasn't any sort of observational facts that were being detected or observed. Rather, this was a kind of a hypothetical story that we can think of insofar as we are offering out kind of a model, a template, a just so story to try to describe the origins of government. So then for Aristotle, we need to begin by thinking about very small groups of individuals. These would be, small groups living in tribes or small villages. And these would be communities composed of families. And so it turns out that the family is very central for Aristotle's view of the origin of the polis. The family structure is what sort of we use to then build out from the family to understand how it is that the polis arises in the first place. So what exactly does that mean? How are we to understand what Aristotle means here? Well, begin with a man and a woman, right? Men and women have certain biological drives, certain functions to reproduce and to want to mate. And so men and women come together to fulfill that end, that particular goal or that function. And in doing so, they then create children, presumably more than one children. And you now have the birth of the family. And the family will be ruled in a hierarchical way. So maybe the father will kind of govern certain activities over the mother and the children. Perhaps the mother will govern other activities Maybe there's some other sort of hierarchical relationship between the man and the woman. And according to Aristotle, this is sort of the basis of the family structure. But once you have that sort of structure in place, you then have grandchildren that come about, and you may even have other servants or maybe even slaves, or there may be other people that are incorporated into the household for one purpose or another. And of course, given all of those different elements in this building up of a family, you have a hierarchical structure in place where one person is governing over another person, depending upon where in that hierarchical structure you're looking at. And of course, it doesn't end there. The family structure continues to grow outwards, and then you get relationships to the community in general. So you now have a community that's sort of a very large family with different hierarchical structures and relations between the members of the community. Finally, the community then grows even larger to now encompass a city state, a general government. So you once again have these different hierarchical relationships throughout the different elements or the different levels of the city state itself. And this all kind of balloons out from the basic center being the family. Or another way of putting that, the household, the relationships that exist amongst the members of a household. Of course, I do want to preface all this by making it clear that we can think about the household and family dynamic and structure, not necessarily in terms of a man and a woman, but we can update this sort of theory for our contemporary society, where it doesn't necessarily need to be a man and a woman. It could be a man and a man or a woman and a woman. Insofar as there are ways in which we can build a family, not necessarily through biological reproduction, but in other ways, right? The basic notion here is the hierarchical structure that's in place and the relationships, the governing relationships amongst a household. While Aristotle definitely does think that there are, by nature, certain hierarchical relationships between men and women and children and so forth, we don't have to think about it that way. So I want to give a kind of a cautionary warning here. But with all of that in mind, we do need to ask this question that I keep coming back to, which is simply, in what way is the polis prior to the individual? In what way am I or you or any other citizens in a political community? How is it that these individuals are dependent upon the government, are dependent upon the city state? However, before we move on to answering that question, it's important to recognize that Aristotle argues that it would be a big mistake to conflate the kind of governing that takes place within a household with the kind of government that ought to occur in political rule, right? So another way of putting this is Aristotle thinks that it's very, very common and widespread to basically assume that governments do take this role of a household management or a household a kind of relationships. And that's a mistake. He thinks that there's other forms of governments that we need to pay attention to, and they're not all simply reducible to the notion of the hierarchical structures that exist within a family or a household. So that's the issue that we will turn to next.